Welcome to the first episode of the Objectivist Blog podcast. I'll be your host, Marcus Burkhart. Now, I think a lot of us outside of the United Kingdom in the sort of wider Anglosphere have kind of watched in some shock and potentially horror, depending on your ideological inclinations, at the latest sort of deranged chaos in the UK. And for that, we have our very own Britbong correspondent here, Mr. Jesse, to discuss this. And I want to open it up with you, Jesse. Like, what could you give for Americans and Australians and Canadians just sort of 1 to 2 minute like TLDR on what the hell happened over the last couple of months with first Boris's ouster, Liz Truss's election as prime minister, and then how the hell she basically stepped down, why she stepped down after 44 days. Which were like mainly tax cuts, and one of the flagship policies that attracted the most controversy, as I understand it, was the move to eliminate the top tax bracket of 45% on income, which was just instituted under Gordon Brown, right? Like it just would have gotten the top rate of tax back to the 40% that it was under Tony Blair in 2007, correct? Right. And reverse the rate of increase of the corporate tax from what the former chancellor Rishi Sunak had proposed. So it's not like there were any real net tax cuts in a sense. It was just reversing the rates of the increase. And yeah, so right. Now, one of the things I find kind of interesting is Liz Truss. I was cautiously optimistic when she was elected. I had actually read this book, which I have here, that she co-wrote. She co-authored with Priti Patel, Dominic Raab, Chris Skidmore, and Kwasi Kwarteng back in 2012, called Britannia Unchained: Global Lessons for Growth and Prosperity. And this was back in 2012. And I believe at the time they were all junior ministers or backbenchers, and they didn't write individually. They basically all signed their names to these essays. It's a small little series of essays. And one of them talks about a contrast between the United Kingdom and Australia in the lead up to the financial crisis. And they wrote together about how Australia in the 1990s and the UK in the 1990s were at roughly similar positions in terms of debt to GDP ratio. And they kind of lampoon that over the 15 years from 1992 to 2007, the UK only ran three budget surpluses in 99, 2000, and 2001. And they compared that to under John Howard, Australia ran surpluses every year from 97 to 2007. And so the result was right before the financial crisis, Australia had 9% debt to GDP compared to Britain with 44%. And actually, a lot of their massive increase in national debt was caused by the reckless irresponsibility of Gordon Brown and then arguably the coalition government in 2010 to 15. So they wrote, debt is never just about debt. It's a symptom of the irresponsibility that runs underneath, an attempt to enjoy more than one is prepared to pay for. Throughout history, governments and investors have found themselves in trouble when they let their optimism run ahead of their caution. States have lost the faith of the markets when they have lost the ability to tell their populations that they can't have everything now. Now, I was, again, cautiously optimistic about Truss and the people she put in government when she was elected prime minister because of this statement. And she talks extensively about how we need to rein in fiscally irresponsible spending. And I didn't see any plan on cutting spending. And they talked a bit about cutting regulations, but they never got specific, despite the fact that there were a lot of announcements in the run up to the mini budget that they'd have a big plan and a big blueprint on deregulation to get economic growth up, which then would lead to increased revenue.
They need to do fiscal discipline 101, which you need to cut spending first and then do the tax cuts because then you can afford it. But before you do all that, the first step you need to do is to deregulate. So it's a 3-stage plan of deregulate, cut spending, and then you go to cutting taxes, and then the Treasury will be able to afford it and the nation can be able to afford it. This was the problem with Liz Truss. I don't think she ever costed her policies during the Conservative Party election. It did not happen at all. And this sent shockwaves throughout the market because the market was just like, no, we can't do this. We have the Bank of England trying to raise interest rates, trying to put the brake on, and you had the government of the day trying to push down hard on the accelerator. And these two conflictions, obviously the Bank of England had to intervene to save the pensions, and it was just very poorly executed from Liz Truss, I have to say, and it's a massive disappointment because I thought it was a nice fresh start for an actual free marketeer to get in there and to ruffle the feathers, but she completely had it the wrong way. It's the right policies, but it was just at the wrong time.
Right. Sure. I just mean to say that I think when you're talking about particularly a country that doesn't have the benefit of having the world's global reserve currency, you need to be particularly cautious when it comes to tax cuts when combined with a massive spending increase, which the energy price cap, I forget the exact technical name, but basically guaranteeing that nobody pays above a certain amount in terms of their energy utility bills, that would cost, I think I saw numbers, £200 billion over the next year and a half without any sort of way to cut other areas of spending to pay for it. And then on top of that, tax cuts. I could see why the bond market would kind of flip out. And particularly the Bank of England supposedly was not consulted on this, nor was the Fiscal Accountability Office, whatever the NGO that is in charge of costing out the government plans and implementing them in the civil services. And, Adam, it kind of reminds me of, in the United States, we have this issue of the Republican Party being the party of, we always criticize the left for being tax and spend. In the Republican Party, it's spend but don't tax, right? And we see this a lot with like the Trump tax cuts being announced without any spending cuts and then actually massive increases in spending, right? In Australia, I've seen since the Howard government, it seems that it's very difficult to do any spending cuts. When there were the last time there was any real effort to do that, I think was in 2014. And
correct,
the
that
treasurer,
was under the Yes Joe Hockey. They
yeah.
tried to introduce a Medicare levy. I think it was $5. If you have to spend $5 to go see a GP, they tried to cut healthcare and pensions as well, I think it was. But the reason why people got upset is because before the election, Tony Abbott promised no cuts to healthcare, no cuts to education, no cuts to pensions.
Prime Minister at the time. Yeah.
Yes, or opposition leader before the 2013 election, where he absolutely cleaned up Labor there. But the problem is that there needs to be a massive shift in our moral and philosophical thinking around the role of government, about changing the way our systems of government interact with the economy, especially with programs such as Medicare here in Australia, school spending, pensions is another big expenditure as well. And of course, those people on other forms of welfare, such as employment benefits, we need to seriously have a good discussion about the role of government in those, and about the way how we can change the role of government. But there's so much money in the education sector, for example. We just need to reverse the funding. Instead of going to the schools and the government provided service, people have vouchers, which then they can shop around and go to the best school that they see fit and have a bit of choice, and that will significantly improve educational outcomes, because that means that schools will have to get competitive, which means they have to get the best teachers, and wages will hence go up as well, because as we all know, under a freer market, especially one where it's deregulated and it's actually in the hands of the consumers, wages go up because there's a lot more competition to have good teachers. And when push comes to shove, money talks. And we need to significantly, and the Liberal Party needs to step up to this platform of real classical liberalism, because at the last election we were not classical liberal at all, and that's exactly what the party was founded on classical liberalism, and we did not reflect those policies at all in the last election.
They were effectively an anti-Labor party, and a lot of the campaigning from the Liberal side, as I observed it just on social media, was mostly centered around fear-mongering over what Labor would do if they got elected. Right.
We're not the Labor Party. That was essentially it. We're not the Labor Party.
Right. And that was also the Trump campaign in 2020. And I think in a large part, 2019 in the United Kingdom was about, we're not insane socialists. And also Brexit was probably the defining issue. And Boris was very good at framing it around that, and also saying, well, we're also not deranged lunatics. Yeah. So Corbyn being so toxic politically to the mainstream, the average voter in the UK, and constituencies which had never voted conservative or hadn't done so in 100 years were flipped. They called it the Red Wall, largely northern England, and other sort of post-industrial areas, as I understand it. So I guess, and I'm all down for, and I agree completely with what you're saying in terms of vouchers and using those sorts of methods to get more choice, more opportunity in the realm of education. We've seen some limited success with that at the state level here in the United States. In Arizona, for example, they just passed probably the best voucher and school choice system in the country. But I don't see any real discussion at the federal level of things like that. And as far as I'm aware, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but the United Kingdom and Australia have not talked about things like that, real dynamic reforms,
No,
at least
no,
not in a
not at
long
all.
time. So,
Well, not.
and I'm no, you know, I don't want to be overly optimistic here, but I'm a cautious optimist about this kind of thing. I do think if you have a leader who's capable of breaking it down in understandable and not so abstract language. I mean, you look at Thatcher and Reagan, they were very, very good at this. They didn't always walk the walk, but they were very good at talking the talk when it came to freedom. And in practical terms, Thatcher talked a lot about, all right, if you're a housewife, you have a certain amount of money coming in, and there's a certain amount that you can spend on groceries. You can't.
Same with Howard.
Right. And they were good at treating the people as adults, right? I think that one of the problems in communication is that the right has largely given up on persuasion, either because they think the people are too dumb, or maybe they just don't believe it. Maybe their hearts are just not in it. I don't know what you guys think is worse, or the bigger source of the problem here. Because it seemed to me that Liz Truss, when she went on TV to try and defend the tax cuts, sure, her heart was just not in it. It's very easy, I think, to persuade and at least make the sort of pragmatic case, like Greg, you were talking about, the moral revolution that needs to occur. And I agree that that needs to happen. But I think even within the realm of pragmatic, utilitarianism, you can kind of say, look, all right, if you cut the rate of income tax from 45 to 40%, that frees up more money for the upper, middle, and upper class to then invest in the economy and start businesses. One of the things I've seen that the Labour shadow chancellor in the UK has proposed is scrapping business rates. And again, for those that don't know, in the UK, you have corporate tax, which is similar to, I think, most Anglo-American countries, which is a tax on corporate profits. But then there's business rates, which are applied to, as I understand it, all fixed assets of the corporation, regardless of like your industrial machinery and the fixed business storefront. And it aggregates all these assets of the business and then it imposes an annual tax on those assets, in addition to the corporate profits tax. So the Labour Party shadow chancellor has come out and proposed completely eliminating the business rate system. And they might do some sort of redistribution nonsense where then they raise the corporate tax rate on businesses making over a certain amount. But I mean, quite literally, that would be huge for small businesses. So where are these kinds of innovative proposals on the right? And again, like in the UK, the last time you saw any sort of dynamic proposals for things like school choice, academization, where you're basically creating in US parlance charter schools and allowing public schools to be converted, government schools to be converted to like quasi-private or quasi-independent schools, was under Tony Blair. So why is it that the right can't propose these things or doesn't want to propose these things? Why is it that it seems like there's a lot of intellectuals within the party that are proposing some really radical reforms. But why can't they ever implement it? Even when they're elected, like Liz Truss, why can they communicate it so well in a book, but they can't go on TV and defend it? That's what I'm a little confused about. I don't know if you guys have answers.
I have to agree with the former Liberal Party leadership of Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg. They signed up to net zero by 2050 as a way to try and gain the votes of those inner city seats, such as Kooyong, where the former treasurer Josh Frydenberg lost his seat to a Teal independent, and they kept on trying to appeal to policies to the centre. But in 2019, we got voted on a mandate that was relatively pro-coal, that was relatively anti-climate change in terms of the targets were different from the Labor Party. They wanted 43% by 2030 emissions reductions. The Liberal Party went on a mandate of 26 to 28% or something. And we actually gained seats in Queensland to have the third term of government of a coalition government. So when the Liberal Party goes to the left, tries to appeal to these inner city greenies, we simply lose. And that's the same thing that we saw in WA as well. Of course, there was other factors such as Mark McGowan being very, very strong on the border, the WA border, essentially cutting WA off from the rest of the country in terms of COVID. But the policies the policies proposed by the then opposition leader at the state level in WA, Zach Kirkup, he wanted to do all this renewable stuff to replace coal and all of that, and those policies would not have gone through the party room. If there was a state conference before the election and that policy was proposed, it would get shot down like there is no tomorrow. And there is a significant disconnect between the parliamentary team and the Liberal Party base, which needs to be reconnected. And we have seen this divide happen in New South Wales before the 2022 election, where Scott Morrison and his factional mate, I suppose, Alex Hawke, intervened into local pre-selections to ensure that the people that in their faction got in instead of people from Tony Abbott's faction, which were actually locally elected and gone through the genuine pre-selection process of the party base. And we and the Liberal Party have gone through that reform here in WA, where where the party base actually now has a vote on who they want as candidate for their local seats. And I think this is a great step forward to actually have a good connection between the party base and the MPs and the candidates as well, because if the party supports the candidates, that means they're going to go out and campaign more, donate more, and we are bleeding votes left, right, and centre, mainly towards the right, because we are simply moving to the left. And now that we have more power, now that the party base has more power, we can hopefully get the Liberal Party back into the right direction, which is, of course, to the right.
Right. And of course, nuclear is probably the easiest silver bullet when it comes to, all right, we can do emissions reductions and not absolutely throttle our competitiveness. Yep. Absolutely not make
And
skyrocketing utility prices.
And ironically, it was John Howard who banned that in 1998 with the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Act.
The supposedly right-wing prime minister of 11 years or something like that.
Who bans an energy source that is clean, safe, and reliable. And I'm thankful that our current leader, Peter Dutton, is finally starting to generate conversation around that. To ensure that we actually have an alternative on there, because Australia is the only OECD country where it is flat out illegal to have it. We can't have anything. The only nuclear reactor we have is to produce medical isotopes at Lucas Heights. That is it. We don't have a civilian nuclear industry. We have talked with the idea of it. Bob Hawke wanted it, a former Labor Prime Minister who was very well respected in the Labor ranks. He wanted it.
Despite having one of the largest uranium reserves in the world.
Yes, that's correct. We have
possibly the largest per capita.
We have 1/3 of the world's uranium reserves, and most of them are in Western Australia and Northern Territory. And we can't use it here, but yet we send it off to France, we send it off to the US, we send it off to Canada, to Britain, to many also to many Asian countries as well, such as South Korea and Japan. But yet we can't use it on our own shore. I mean, this is just ridiculous. We need to legalize it, and then we need to implement, and then we actually need to start building it, because we can't get to net zero or reduce or significantly decarbonize our economy and keep it economically sustainable without nuclear power. We have seen this in Europe. They've tried to get rid of nuclear power, and look at Germany now. They have significantly relied on natural gas. We significantly rely on China for our renewables, because we send our coal, our iron ore, our lithium, our gold, our silver, all to China, and it all comes back as solar panels. And at one point, the Chinese could just go, "No, we've had enough. You are no longer getting wind turbines. You are no longer getting solar panels." Then what are we going to do? You're
basically outsourcing these pollutive industries to other countries. Which is, it's not doing anything to move the needle globally. And I guess this whole emissions issue is a global problem. It's been a little bit more resilient here in the US in terms of being a salient political issue, but I have seen polls that show young people are very, very concerned about climate change as a top priority. You've seen things like the Green New Deal, the basic banning of a lot of new natural gas and oil projects. The US was actually, incidentally, the only major economy in the OECD, as I understand it, that was actually on track to meet its Paris Accord targets, despite pulling out of it. And that was mostly because we were refitting coal plants to run on natural gas. So most of our emissions reductions were accomplished by moving from coal to nat gas. And if we were then to move to nuclear, it would be almost completely eliminated, if that's something that you care about.
Yes. Yeah.
One of the other things is cost of living crisis seems to be a big political issue.
Oh, yes.
Throughout.
Especially here.
So,
yep.
In the US as well, and Adam, you're in LA, right? The mayor's race that's coming up is basically that's one of the top issues, right? And I mean, you have some relatives who work in the real estate business, in the construction business, right? So how do you think zoning and sort of land use law factors into this whole issue? And do you think that's a big missed opportunity for people on the right? Adam?
Living in LA, it's so apparent just by looking around and looking at the cost of living, how much the zoning regulations really profoundly affect people's lives. But despite that, there seems very little push to reform those, because I don't think people generally associate that as the source of the problem. And they don't.
Yeah, they'll often talk about like increasing public housing investment, right? But like to their credit, it does seem like both candidates in the mayoral election have talked about easing permitting requirements and things like that, particularly Rick Caruso, right?
Yeah, and that's one thing that's quite promising. Even Karen Bass, she is getting on board with that. Even though, if you look at her political ideology, she's very much on the left. You would not think someone that far left would be talking about these things and actively campaigning on them, but considering that she is, I think that's a good sign. That's true.
Maybe there is groundswell support for it. It's just one of these issues where, kind of like protectionism, there's a very well organized lobby in favor of keeping things the way that they are. And there's a sort of decentralized groundswell of support for changing things if only the people knew about them. So that is to say, maybe if there were candidates who were actively proposing these reforms, and to their credit, the California legislature has amended some of these planning laws to allow at least some easing of single family zoning. I know that this is, I think, in all three of our countries, largely a local government issue. So do we think maybe this could be something that should be waged as a local government issue? I know we have someone here who has done some work with local government politicians. Does it seem like there's any sort of hope for this sort of thing from a bottom-up perspective, maybe, as opposed to a top-down one? Right. So that is to say, they can set a minimum at the central government level in terms of regulation, and the local governments can impose additional regulatory requirements, but they can't really undercut it. So things like the green belt, as I understand it, where the central government effectively cordons off land from development, right? That's largely a matter of the central government, correct? Now, as I understand it, a very large percentage of the UK is reserved for the green belt. And this has been kind of a bipartisan issue to cordon off more and more land from development, which has benefited real estate developers because this is just a supply and demand issue, right? The more you constrict supply artificially, the higher land prices become. So once you've bought a house, it's very difficult to then tell that voter, oh, we want to like make it easier for people to build and lower the cost of housing, which would then lower your real estate investment. That's at work, right? Like it would reduce the value of your home. So politically, that's like a very difficult thing to do in a lot of our countries. But again, like Adam was discussing in the US, you've seen some success at the local level in California, perhaps because it's just so high. Um, why is it that the right doesn't take this up as a big unifying issue? Because I think, particularly with young people who are struggling to buy a home, I know in California it's very common that people don't buy their first home and move out from their parents' house until they're in their 30s. So would this
Yeah,
not be a huge boost
I think there's hope
to
among young people. But one
Mhm.
thing I would like to add that's definitely true in California and the United States, and this might be true elsewhere as well, is there seems to be a general concession that some form of planning and zoning is necessary. You can talk to people and they might say, okay, yeah, we should reform zoning, we should do X, Y, and Z, we should allow higher density in these certain areas. But when you propose that the government has no role in zoning to begin with or planning, they say, well, there needs to be some planning or some zoning. So there's just a cultural acceptance that, yeah, the government has to be involved in zoning, because how else would it work? It would just be chaos otherwise. It's the
Right, and
implicit
then you look at
assumption.
places like Houston, right, where there have been no zoning laws and there's
Yeah.
no centralized downtown. And sometimes people will complain about that, but Houston is probably one of the most affordable major metro areas in the United States. I know plenty of young people who, straight out of college, straight out of law school, bought their first house without much money in the bank. And they're able to get bedroom houses. Yeah,
Houston is your case study in what happens
yeah.
with zoning. But and even when you bring up Houston, I've brought up Houston with people. I say, well, what about Houston? And I give them some statistics about Houston. And they're like, oh, well, that's just one city in Texas. Like they don't see that. That's some isolated case that cannot possibly apply to a major city like Los Angeles or New York. Really, it's no different. It's how markets work.
Right. And I mean,
When you take the government out of zoning planning, you're going to get a result like Houston. Even in a major city like LA or New York, you're going to have substantial
and this
improvements.
is all about fundamentally a property rights issue, right? It's I can do on this land
Correct.
what I want because I own it. And it's effectively giving the government veto power
Yep.
over what you can do with your own property.
And
Um,
Australia is insane for that, because if you want to, like, depending on the council, which is the local government, depending on that, you have to submit your house plan to the council for them to approve. And this just shows that there's no need for that to happen. And Adam's right.
Do you mean the
Yes, the design, the
or
height,
do they frame it
everything.
as a
They
safety
look at
issue?
everything, and
Okay,
it's just insane, because you've bought the land, you've paid the stamp duty on that land, which is a state government tax, and this is where the state government gets involved as well with all these with their own planning laws and land allocations as well. But for residential, it's mainly council, which is local government, and they have to approve the house that you're going to build on your own property. And if you want to build a house that is not structurally sound, you should be able to do that, because you should be able to do what you see fit on your private property. And this is another issue here in Australia as well, which we haven't talked about in this, is NIMBY, not in my backyard. Now, there's a lot of push at the moment, generally around the country, of developers developing high rises and a relatively compact living here in Australia, but yet people whinge about high house prices. Well, clearly there needs to be education on demand, on basic demand and supply. If you increase the supply of something and demand stays the same, prices will drop. And this is not we're not seeing this in Australia. In fact, Australian governments, both state and federal, have boosted the demand of housing, and our housing market is significantly overvalued. And Marcus is right; it's pushing young people, especially, out of the housing market, and the economic consequences of not having a house, which means that there's a likelihood of less kids, because people can't afford, because it's all been sucked up by this overvalued asset, and you need a mortgage to pay for that. There needs to be fortnightly payments, weekly payments, or whatever the customer sees fit to the bank. And it's just all been sucked up into this. And Australia at the moment, with the interest rates going up so high in a relatively short period of time, it is going to hurt a lot of people. And we need significant deregulation around the housing market, especially with planning laws, to allow people what they see fit to do with their own land. No one should be telling other people what to do with their private property. And that brings back to Adam's point and Marx's point that we need to respect property rights. And the only way we can do that is to have a moral and philosophical discussion around the role of government and the role of property rights.
Interest, right? No, you go ahead. Sorry.
One thing that exists in LA, and I think almost probably every major city in that United States and internationally, you tell me how it is in Australia and the UK, but that is the issue of protected historical status being placed on private property. And once that is in place, then you have the local government um, viciously dictating what you can and cannot do with your property. And obviously, they already are zoning and with building regulations. But I feel like that transcends to a new level. And there's also kind of a general acceptance that, well, yeah, if something's historical,
It
it
has
has public
intrinsic
value.
value
That's what you'll
to
hear
those who
commonly. And
don't live in it.
yeah, it has
Yeah.
intrinsic value. Exactly. So therefore, we can infringe on your property rights to a unlimited extent. Is that
Oh,
something you
yes,
have in
we most
Australia?
certainly do.
If so, I'd like to hear your thoughts.
But again, it depends on the case. Like if it's just a little cottage that with real no historical significance, and if someone wants to build a brand new house on it, they should do that. But when it comes to a prison such as Fremantle Prison, where they wanted to knock down Fremantle Prison, which has been open since the 1830s, I think, when the first convicts arrived here in Western Australia, and there's a lot of history with that, and they want to knock that down and build a supermarket there. Now, there was a grassroots community effort to protect it because obviously a prison being built by convicts, there's a lot of history there, and I think that you guys can all agree that we need that protection of that prison. It means a lot to local community. It means a lot to tourism as well, to have tours and stuff. And I've done a couple of the night tours, and it's absolutely great. Um, and we need to protect those very significant historical cultural sites. But if it's just an old pub that the owner wants to significantly refurbish but keep some of the old style, they should be able to do that without the council or the state government interfering on that. And there should also in Australia, we need to significantly look at these laws again to ensure that the balance is right. But also, there's a role for community to play as well. If people want to voluntarily do a campaign to save a building, they should be more than welcome to do that. And of course, this is where contracts come in as well, which is of course
Raise money for it.
yeah, exactly.
Right?
Which is a very key part of the idea of limited government is that there's contracts, and if the community wants to buy it back, raise the funds. They've done this with ships. I think the USS Texas was saved. Am I correct? By the community, by grassroots effort to raise the donations and buy it off the Navy and have it in the museum. And people should be able to do that if they see fit. If a significant historical building is going to be demolished by its private owner and the community says no, the community should have the ability to come together, raise funds, and buy it off the owner and have it as a community tourism business or something like that.
Right.
And if it's of value to enough people, that should be
And if it's not,
feasible
then
to do. And if it's not, then
in the UK, is it Bath that has the straw roofs, and anytime you need to like repair the roof, you have to get government permission? There's somewhere in the UK where this is the case, right? They have these historical. Yeah, and I don't think we need to go around advocating the privatization of Buckingham Palace. At least I wouldn't start with that. But like, I think that when it comes to these houses, you know, there's a balancing that you can do where, well, let me ask you this. Do you think that if local governments were empowered more to independently exercise their own judgment about these sorts of things, as opposed to having it dictated from Westminster, do you think that they would do more development and allow more multi-use buildings, such as like in the U.S., in New York City, historically one of the big things that immigrants, you have a cafe, restaurant on the first floor, and then have 3 floors above that. You might live in the second floor and then rent out the top two. But that's not allowed in most municipal zoning codes in most big cities, and I assume the same thing in most neighborhoods in the UK. Do you think that more local governments would make the decision to liberalize significantly if they were given the opportunity to do so? Mm. Now, this is where you could steal a lot of the center left's historic base is young working class professionals who just want to get their foot on the rung of property ownership, right? Like this could be right to buy 2.0 if you allow, if you champion the cause of liberalizing planning. If you allow the conservative local governments to then deregulate, and or if you fund maybe from the top down, it would be even more effective. You force them to liberalize. You would probably see a big uptick in the support for conservative policies among young people. You need to. There's a big underclass essentially that's been created by our mixed mongrel economies, where basically, if you're young or working class, it is significantly more difficult for you to get a foot on the rung of the ladder of property ownership. And that creates this class of people who are essentially schizo swing voters who don't know who to support. And that's because essentially both major parties have given up advocating for them or for policies that would
And
actually benefit them.
especially in Australia, because both Liberal and Labor, they support only demand side incentives. For example, the Morrison government in 2020, when COVID happened, the government of the day allowed people to take up to $40,000 to put down on a deposit, to help put down on a deposit on their home,
Right.
they're trying to buy. And the problem is that
Yeah,
that's not addressing the issue. That's addressing the
no.
symptom of the cause of the problem. And the
It's
cause
the
of the
same in the
problem,
United States. Yeah.
the cause of the problem is there's not enough supply, there's too much regulation, and there's a completely screwed up tax code here in Australia. It is in
Yeah.
those three things, and it is political suicide for those parties, for any of those parties to touch those three things that I just mentioned, especially the tax code, because we have a thing called negative gearing here in Australia, where it essentially incentivizes people to make a loss on a rental that they own, and then the losses that they incur can be written off as part of their income tax. Therefore, they're getting taxed less because they can. So, for example, if you have a rental property that is costing you $300 a week, but you only get $250 a week, that difference of $50 can be taken off your income. So let's say you earn $50,050. Instead of being taxed at that rate, you're being taxed at $50,000. And now that's costing the government. So that's costing the government as well approximately $13 billion per year. If we get rid of that,
Right.
we can easily afford to significantly cut company tax to a flat 20% rate. And that will significantly improve the allocation of resources within our economy.
It's renters subsidizing developers, essentially. So, and in the United States, we have something similar where you can deduct your mortgage payments off of your income tax. So the government will essentially take money from renters and give it to homeowners. So there's massive distortions within the tax code for this sort of thing. And like you said, it's not addressing the supply side. And what you do when you constrict the supply is you raise the prices and then you subsidize the increase in the prices. And until recently, we had essentially unlimited state and local tax deductions at the federal level. So like if you're in a state that's very highly taxed, well, you can write off your New York State income taxes on your federal tax returns. So it's effectively a subsidy from low tax states to the higher tax states at the federal level. So it's redistributing income from usually poorer states that are lower taxed to the higher income, higher tax states. And so they don't have to suffer the political consequences at the local and state level for enacting these insanely regressive state income taxes, like in New York City or in California.
There should be a flat income tax in Australia, and it should be about 18%, because that's it, like with a flat tax, people will not be bothered to go around these loopholes. They can get rid of these loopholes. It would be very simplified tax code, and it is fair because I'm getting taxed at 18%. People on $200,000 is getting taxed at 18%, and of course, the rich do pay their fair share. The rich in this will pay their fair share because they'll be paying the same rate as everyone else, and the more you earn, the more you get taxed, because you simply earn more, but the rate stays the same, and that will significantly help people from overseas who want to come here and to work to Australia to actually stay here in Australia, because money talks. And if half your income just disappears overnight because the government says so, people will leave. And we've seen that exactly in California, and I'm sure you, Marcus, and Adam can speak on that a bit more. When you raise taxes, people will go. If you lower them, people will come to you because people want more of their own money.
Right. And in the UK, you see this.
Yeah. That's true.
Yeah. With. Yeah. No, you continue. I'm sorry. There needs to be what?
I was just going to mention how the lack of economic literacy plays into this among voters, because I think that's a substantial issue with just recognizing how these policies profoundly impact one's life, ability to buy property and to lead a successful life.
Yeah.
And these are all economic issues at heart. I think there's understanding of even basic concepts like supply and demand. I think most people learn supply and demand is, but I think for most people remains as a floating abstraction, and they never get to the point where they can apply the idea of supply and demand to something like housing.
They don't see an alternative, right?
And
they don't see it directly.
Yeah.
They see that housing prices are going up, and I don't think most people understand or are even aware of more than half the regulations. Like we were talking one day about how you can't have a yard sale without the city's permission in Los Angeles. You need city permits in order to have a yard sale. So,
and
yeah.
And Adam, it's very interesting you just brought up the economic literacy in Australia, and I've actually just got a graph in front of me here. Economics enrollments in Australia in year 12, which is people aged between 16, 17 and 18. In 1990, in the early 90s, it was up to 40,000. Now it's down to
I'm sorry, what was the measure?
Economic students enrolled in year 12, which is people aged 16, 17, and 18. And in the 1990s, it was up to 40,000. Now it is down to just above 10,000. just above 10,000. And
I don't know how much you can conclude off of that, but definitely that is a very sharp decline. And
I think some of it has to do with just the moral zeal with which we pursue this stuff, right? Because you have the left that are screaming up and jumping up and down about how like the rich aren't paying their fair share, and I think people listen up. Sure,
which is complete rubbish, because the top 2% here in Australia pay 40% of all income taxes collected over a financial year.
And in the US, it's the top 1% pay 37%, give or take. So,
and these rich people, like in my home state of like Twiggy Forrest, Andrew Forrest, Gina Reinhart, they employ thousands of people and they provide billions of dollars to both the public and private sectors in the form of taxes, investments, job creation, etc., to the local community. And they do give back to the local community, especially Gina Reinhart, who in fact, she tried to give $15 million to a netball association here in Australia, but the Netball Association rejected her because of her stance on climate change.
I think that.
I think this just underscores the whole.
Correct.
For economic
but I think more than that, you need an emphasis on the moral aspect of this. You need people who are actually convinced, A, that they're in the moral right when they're arguing for freedom, and B, frame it as a freedom issue. Because you can show someone a supply and demand graph until they're blue in the face, but if you're not pairing that with moral rhetoric, people are just kind of going to say, well, this is just an abstract thing. No, they are forcing you, telling you, dictating to you what you can do with your own property. They are forcing you to pay well above what you should be paying for a house. They're making it impossible for you to get any financial independence. They're forcing you to live with your parents until you're 35. And they're doing it in order to line their own pocket with donations from certain, not all, not even necessarily the majority, but certain interest groups, such as, single family homeowners in Palo Alto, that lobby excessively to prevent any new housing construction. A 3-bedroom, 3-bed, 2-bath house in Palo Alto costs $5 million.
Oh my God.
I believe that's
it's
the most
one of the
expensive
most
per square foot
in the United States. It's in the top 10. Now, this is right next to Silicon Valley.
Everyone wants to be there. The local economy, it's still booming. But if you want to actually live up there, you have to pay the price.
And
I mean, there's no reason to be that way, though, right?
Now, if it was like San Jose and it was actually built up, you might have an apartment that would cost $500,000 with 2 bedrooms and 2 baths. And I think most people would take that over a $5 million single family home. But you need to allow people to build up and build up a lot.
Correct. And that comes back to the attitude of not in my backyard, which Australia is infamous for. And if someone wants to build a high rise on their own property, so what? It's their bloody property. They should do what they see fit, not telling other people what to do. And not them being told by other people what to do.
I think that's right. That's really beyond just
and
literacy. You have to promote the case that property rights are absolute, and if you acquire a piece of property,
they are inalienable
through your own merits, and no one has the.
Yeah, it's stealing, really, when you think about it.
Exactly,
it's depriving you of your property. Yeah, it's coercive, and it's extortionist.
It would be really good if culturally that was viewed as stealing. That would be a very.
How many permits do you need to file?
People associate that.
If you want to build a new house or apartment unit, how many permits do you have to file in LA? How long does the permitting process take?
Yeah, I don't know the exact number of permits, but it depends on the size and the scope of the project and all that. But I know for a small apartment building, the permitting process, I think it took about 6 months.
Right. And that's money where this is one of those issues. You took out a loan to buy the property. You're paying property taxes on it. You're paying mortgage payments on it. And potentially you're paying workers to sit there, not able to do anything. Not to mention you're paying a tax guy, an accountant, and a lawyer to file all this paperwork for
Or
you.
a mortgage broker and a settlement agent.
Right. And it's just,
yeah, and not to mention is this scope of the project goes up. So
not to mention the filing costs, the filing fees associated with each permit that you file. Oh, and if you did it wrong, you have to refile it again and pay the same fee over again.
To mention the LA Department of Building and Safety was closed for 2 years due to COVID. You could, if you wanted to speak to them, you had to, I believe you had to get a meeting on Zoom or you had to send them emails, but you could not go down to their office because they simply refused to show up because of COVID, blaming COVID. So that made the problem infinitely worse, and the time it took to get permits skyrocketed. And I don't know what it's like right now, but my guess is there's a huge backlog, and 2 years they were just completely lost because they decided they didn't want to show up to work.
Bureaucracy kills business and kills people's dreams and hopes. That's the reality. And here in Australia, the bureaucracy is insane, and the amount of people that get paid to sit on their bums and do nothing all day is just ridiculous.
I think that's
And the
pretty
only
much
way we
true.
can do it is to have a serious questioning of our current morals and ethics with objectivism, because that's the only way I can see society progressing at a significantly better pace. We need to go to the principles of objectivism to have a much better outcome for society.
And I think it starts
Absolutely.
with person to person. It starts local with your friends and family, and it starts with, again, just the moral framing. You can talk about supply and demand and economic illiteracy till you're blue in the face, but fundamentally, if they don't morally agree with you, they're going to vote against their own self-interest. And you see that in California with residents of Malibu voting to raise their own taxes a few years ago by like 70%. So
and Jan Brook always talks about this. The out of the 10 richest counties in the United States, 8 of them voted Democrats, who at the time wanted to propose a higher tax on the rich. And to me, that's just I can't comprehend that, because why would you want to vote to have more of your hard-earned money taken away from you by coercion?
It's a combination of things. It's guilt, and there's that, but there's also, I think, the perception, which is valid, of Republicans as scientifically illiterate and as theocrats and as anti-immigrant, right? So, like, if you had a Republican Party that was not motivated in large part by theocratic ambitions of banning abortion or of, attempting to restrict immigration in a significant way, that would significantly do a lot to help their cause and their appeal among these voters, but then they would lose the votes of the theocrats, right? So it's like a trade-off. And they promote banning the teaching of evolution, or now they're talking about, in some states, banning contraception, right? So I'm actually convinced at this point that the best course of action might be to try and work with the utilitarian Democrats, the less wacky Democrats, because the Republican Party is just it's becoming beyond repair. Even if Trump doesn't run and win, I think that a lot of the leading figures in the GOP right now are so drenched in populism that I think that they're much more interested in fighting the culture wars than they are about the business of governing, repairing the economy. I mean, some of them could care less. So I think there's more hope for the Liberal Party of Australia and the Conservative Party of Britain in this respect than the GOP, which is unfortunate. But I mean, it's Democrats in California that are talking about some
I
of the
agree,
zoning reforms.
because the Liberal Party moderate faction at the last election got absolutely walloped. And with the more, there's two other factions. You got the centre right and the hard right. Those two have remained relatively intact, and I think that led by Peter Dutton, I think that the Liberals have a really good chance of going back to their roots of classical liberalism and getting back those suburban voters, because you're not going to win those inner city seats where the Greens have a huge influence now over the inner city people who don't really know the processes of human society and their economics and their morals as well, because they really have a sense of, let's just help other people. Let's just help other people, not myself. But the thing is, though, with people in these suburban areas who go to work 9 to 5, who have a mortgage to pay, who have a couple of kids or a few kids or whatever, they really need to get back. They really look at from a pocketbook point of view that, hang on, I need to look for a party that has good, sound economic policies that will significantly decrease the cost of living pressures, that will significantly reduce my power bill, my gas bill, my water bill, just everyday expenses. And I think that hopefully the Liberal Party goes in the right direction, and hopefully we can win the next 2025 election.
Here's hoping, and good luck to you in that respect. Adam, we have a much tougher slog here in the United States, but I think with that, I think we can kind of conclude by saying that the fight continues, and there's some rays of hope across the horizon. So let's just keep hammering home the point about this is affecting your daily life, and it may seem abstract. So let's break it down into simpler terms that the average person can understand, right? And I think framing it as a personal freedom issue, framing it as a, not even an economic but a moral issue, is the most effective way of doing it. So with that, thank you very much for listening. We really appreciate your listenership and your readership. Good night.